Welcome back. Paul here. We're going to be talking about the Romantic movement or Romanticism. This is a movement that happened roughly between the late 1700s up until about the mid 1800s. This movement follows the Neoclassical movement, and I think the best way to talk about this Romantic era is to sort of do a little bit of compare and contrast of the Neoclassical movement that came before it and the Romantic era that we're talking about. I think that will give us a good idea of how this is situated in history, how it's situated in our thoughts when we think about literature, and it also gives us a little bit of a deeper understanding of the neoclassical era. So just because this follows the neoclassical era doesn't mean we need to think of it as a reaction to it or a reaction against it. The way we think about movements is, we look retroactively with sort of a historic eye, and we decide how can we think of these works as having some sort of progression through history and through our human social world. And we have to make some sort of distinction between one thing and another. So when we're kind of moving along chronologically through these different movements, we have to think about it complexly and not with a simplistic eye. So, yes, the Romantic movement is going to have a lot of features to it that are sort of reactions to and reactions against the neoclassical movement that came before it. But there's also going to be a certain amount of blending. There's going to be a certain amount of influence. There's going to be a certain amount of thoughts that are just being carried through and kind of cross over a threshold that we've decided is there to sort of become another thing. None of these movements are ever a single thing. These movements are all groups of works that we have been poring over, sometimes for centuries, and trying to figure out how they fit into our thinking and into our history. And we look for features in them that we can kind of have, similarities between, and then we create these movements. And we can think of these movements as being pretty important because they really are products of their times and they sort of mark what was happening in history and how we were thinking. We also have to be careful not to take them completely literally because they can change at any time as our thinking changes. We might start to think differently about some era of history and like subtract or add different things to the canon of that time. Lots of things can happen. So let's try to stay fluid with our thinking as we go through these. Um, so the features of Romanticism are, first of all, it started off as being a European movement, but it was happening during a time when democracy was starting to expand. So it ends up over here in America too. And when you look at romantics in America, we might have different names for the movement. Like we might call them transcendentals, or we might call them American Renaissance, and all of these different complications within the movement are perfect. That's what this is all about. So we're going to call it all romanticism, even though you can look even closer and start to find different ideas within it, different movements even within it. So romanticism, in contrast to neoclassicism, which was emphasizing orderly thinking, logic, classical forms of things, and but then also bringing those sort of ancient classical Greek forms into the present by adding things like modern settings and especially satire to make fun of what the very thing that they're trying to perfect, which all complicated it. In contrast, Romanticism is thinking less about logic and order and more about emotion and subjectivity and nature, personal creativity, how can we be individuals, and things like that. Um, Freedom, democracy, having self-actualization is part of this, but then also in the larger picture, nature plays a big part in Romanticism. And Romanticism sees nature as almost this living thing, almost this character in all these stories that is a place to escape the sort of modern industrial world and a place to find your spirituality. And there's almost sort of this I guess spiritual dialogue between the human soul and nature that happens. Romanticism also, it has a, I guess, a sense of like nostalgia to it. It's always wanting to look back to when times were more romantic, when there was chivalry in the world, so medieval times, when people were more easily able to think freely about their own superstitions and their beliefs and folklore and wild stories that come out of the imagination that are fantastical. It likes to add elements of this also, which is like, in defiance of a purely logical kind of writing. Um, so you can see there are a lot of different features in this movement, and they don't always all harmonize with themselves. So it becomes a complicated task to decide what is Romanticism exactly. When you look at a specific text, how does it fall into Romanticism, and how maybe does it not fall in? How does it challenge the movement and set itself apart in some way? So we're going to be looking for similarities in these pieces of literature. And we're also going to be looking at anomalies and differences and things that complicate things. Because looking at the complications and why things don't always exactly work out the way you want, why things aren't in tidy little packages all the time, is an important part of the work that we do in literature. So some of the key people in this Romanticist movement are William Wordsworth. One of the poems he wrote was Tintern Abbey, and we'll be taking a look at that one. And it's sort of a pastoral poem. He's a nature poet, so I'll talk a little bit more about that particular poem because that's one that we're going to be reading. I'll talk about that at the end. But we have Edgar Allan Poe on the American side of it, who is very solidly in the Romantic tradition, but in the dark Romantic tradition, sort of the Gothic romance, where he looks at the supernatural and he's looking at intuition rather than logic, and what I find to be really fun things like that. William Blake, a European, he's really into talking about freedom and the practical things we need to do to become free. Percy Shelley, very important figure and very known for imagery, sometimes very dark imagery. Of course, Percy Shelley is married to Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, and she's also in this tradition. I'll talk about her when I'm talking about some of the novels. John Keats, again, freedom, imagery, sometimes darkly romantic. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, you've probably heard of Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is this giant epic poem that he wrote, and has a lot to do with the mythology and our own superstitions, and it's very, very cool. As far as like novelists go, I mentioned Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. Frankenstein is very much a romantic novel. It's sort of gothic. It's an exploration of our emotions. It's sort of a commentary on society and our emotions. It's very much steeped in nature and things that are unnatural and things that tickle the imagination and kind of scare you a little bit. We have Sir Walter Scott, who wrote Ivanhoe, which is a really different kind of thing, but it's pretty political, about the history of Scotland, and again, about finding that individuality and freedom. And then we have the Bronte sisters, so Charlotte and Emily Bronte. Emily Bronte wrote Wuthering Heights, and Charlotte Bronte wrote Jane Eyre, of course, and I'm particularly interested. I think that one really good illustration can come out of Wuthering Heights, um, that illustrates sort of this dark romance in a way, where the one of the main characters named Heathcliff, his lover dies, and his love for her is so deep and so all encompassing and so irrational that he feels the need to go dig her dead body up so that he can hold her one more time. And it's dark and creepy, but also just really beautiful and emotional. And just like moments like that, I think, kind of are the moments that we can look for as intuitive factors that cause us to think that this is part of the Romantic era, right? Um, so there are a lot of ways that we can sort of look at how this romanticist feeling kind of comes to be in different forms in different pieces of literature. And we can include all of those. And then we can also ponder, well, what's going on here? How do these things really fit together, and how can we change our thinking about it? Because that's part of what we do as we look back to in the field of literature. Oh, I should just mention, like in the U.S. Well, no, I should. Let me just talk a little bit about the historical setting that Romanticism was taking place in. Um, so there were kings in Europe were sort of toppling. People in Europe are really getting tired of monarchy. Back in the Renaissance, the idea of the public sphere came into being. And originally that was like the monarchies approved of it because it was a place for people to go and gather and meet with people who they had never met before and bitch about the monarchy, really, right? And the monarchy thought, well, maybe this will be cathartic for people. We'll let them complain about us out in public, but then when they're in court or when they're like in formal situations, they'll behave. Well, I think that this idea of public just gained more and more momentum. So by this era, which is a couple hundred years later, um, the public has taken control of the hearts and minds of society. And the monarchies are in trouble. People don't want kings anymore. That translates to the United States. The United States was freshly off a revolution. There was a brand new union here, and the union was being built explicitly on the ideals of individualism, freedom, freedom from religion, freedom to be the self, very rugged kind of stuff, right? Um, in fact, let me show you a couple. So in the United States, the Romantic era took on a little bit of a different flavor because it was this very rugged American individualistic thing that was happening. It was still very, very within the Romantic era, but you might call it something like the American Renaissance. So we've got like Walt Whitman, um, transcendental thinkers, right? Here's Nathaniel Hawthorne. This is House of the Seven Gables, and this is a little bit more of like a dark Gothic romance, which I love. But then you've also got Henry David Thoreau. So he writes Walden. It's not dark and Gothic. It's more about just individuality, freedom, and thinking about your own psyche. Different things, but still within the same wheelhouse, right? Edgar Allan Poe, of course, yet another one of these Gothic writers who's very solidly in the Romantic tradition. Who do you have? Oh, Herman Melville, of course. So Moby Dick. More of those, like what people thought of as American ideals, right? Emerson, another one of these transcendentals who thinks a lot about democracy and how individuals can collectively stay individuals and make up a nation. So slightly different flavor in the United States, but you can see how this idea of thinking about the self and thinking about how to exist in a society while still being a creative individual, and while thinking about how relationships can be these personally empowering things rather than something that's like at the societal level. All of these ideas are present. So what I want us to do is look at three different works from kind of splattered throughout, I guess, this like 70 or so year period, that all have different kind of flavors and are all expressing Romanticism in different ways. So we're going to look at William Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey, which was 1798. We're going to look at Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, which is 1813. And we're going to look at Edgar Allan Poe's Fall of the House of Usher, which was 1839. Now, when we actually look at these, we're going to do it slightly out of chronological order, just because the whole book ordering process, I'm trying to be sensitive to that maybe taking a little bit longer. So I'm arranging it so that we read Jane Austen last, because that gives us a little bit more time to get the book. But okay, so William Wordsworth, we're going to be looking at his poem, and he's a nature poet. So Tintern Abbey is about him returning to a place that he hasn't been in some years, and he's looking at the nature around him and kind of meditating on it, thinking about how, like in his wild youth, he was connected with nature in a certain way, and now that he's more mature, the connection is different. But about how like nature has been spiritually feeding him this whole time, and evolving, helping him to evolve into the person that he is. Um, so the spiritual connection to nature. He's also thinking about his family, he's thinking about his sister, and you can kind of wrap all this stuff up together and think about how does this express romanticism. We're going to be reading Jane Austen then, and so when you read Pride and Prejudice, you're going to have to realize that it really challenges the movement. There are people who are going to try to put Pride and Prejudice into a different movement than Romanticism. And there are valid arguments for doing that. So what it does express, as far as the Romantic movement goes, is that it's about love and individuality. It's about sort of like self-reflection and self-actualization, trying to learn who you are as a person. It's all done through love and being an individual and still being able to be in love. So it has a lot in common with the Romantic era, but also it kind of makes fun of all that stuff. It makes fun of the way society is. It makes fun of the way love always has to turn out a certain way. So in that way, it kind of has some things in common with the neoclassicists, with the satire. It's a little bit satirical. It's playful. It's humorous. And it also, a lot of people will want to put this book into the realist genre, which we'll be talking about later, really because it kind of, it talks about day-to-day issues. It talks about society and economics and money, and it's really just about real life and real connections that people have, and the sort of um, maybe consciousness of it and a conscience for what it needs to be. So you can see how this really bends and distorts Romanticism if we're going to place it into that movement. That's not a problem. The fact that this book kind of defies the boundaries that we want to put around Romanticism makes it the perfect book to study within Romanticism, because we need to be challenging the boundaries and the borders of everything that we categorize things in, because categorizations are just semi-arbitrary things that we create. So the more we can at once respect Romanticism as a movement that we can learn a lot from, and also challenge it as something that's not just static and not just like sort of plopped there in a form that will always be in, but something that's dynamic, that's where it's at as far as studying literature goes. So we'll definitely have fun studying the Jane Austen novel. And then, of course, we'll be studying Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. And this one is, it's romantic in that it's it explores things like social isolation, confusion about what's real and what's fantasy, which kind of equals horror, right, in the human mind. It sort of explores what are the limits of human consciousness, right? So explores sanity. And it's all done so within sort of these dynamic relationships where people are trying to figure out who they are. And very neatly fits into sort of the dark romantic movement. So these are three very different novels with three different ideas and three different sort of manifestations of the romantic ideal within them. In order to like really understand Romanticism, you have to spend years of your life on it. So like those of you who are going to grad school, you'll have the opportunity to focus on an era of literature or on a movement. So you might focus on Romanticism, you might focus on like postmodernism, or like whatever it is that you really like, and you'll spend years just in that one area becoming expert in it. In a big survey class like this, you're going to get a good feel for it. You're going to be able to figure out some of the features of it. You're going to be able to figure out which of these movements do you enjoy more, and which one do you think speak to you more. You're not going to get a super deep understanding of it, but you're going to have a good understanding that you can do something with in the future whenever you choose to make that next step. So that was a very quick introduction to Romanticism. This video is about as long as I like my videos to be, so I am going to stop here. But please make sure that you look at the other videos that are in this unit, because I'm going to be talking about more specifics, and I'm going to be talking about these texts a little bit more specifically and giving some instructions about how to go about doing everything that you need to do in this unit. Thank you, and I will see you in the next video.